The deeper you dig into the chronicles of previous ages, the clearer one terrifying thought becomes. Humanity knows almost nothing about its actual past. Official history resembles a thin curtain concealing the wreckage of something colossal, something we've been trained to forget. The most striking evidence of this disconnect exists in the paintings of Hubert Robert, the famous French artist who traveled extensively throughout Europe in the 18th century. What he left behind isn't just art. It's documentation that today sparks fierce controversy because it simply doesn't align with what we've been taught to believe about that period. Modern academia dismisses his subjects as flights of fancy. Art historians insist these landscapes are capriccios, architectural fantasies, romantic inventions created to entertain wealthy patrons with a taste for melancholy ruins. We're supposed to accept that Robert simply imagined worlds that never existed, painting elaborate lies for a bored aristocracy. But if you set aside these imposed interpretations and examine Robert's work through the lens of engineering or architecture, something entirely different emerges. You're confronted with incredibly detailed colonnades, building levels descending deep underground, and stone blocks fitted together with a precision that the builders of his own era couldn't achieve. A persistent impression forms that Robert wasn't inventing anything. He was recording. He functioned not as a dreamer, but as an honest documentarian, meticulously sketching what existed right in front of him. A world that even in his time lay in ruins, the remnants of something that had already been destroyed. This hypothesis raises an uncomfortable but unavoidable question. If the artist was depicting reality as he encountered it, then who built these cyclopean structures? And more importantly, when? The civilization contemporary to Robert himself appears frankly primitive and backwards when compared to these remains. The people of his era possessed neither the technology to restore these giants nor even the knowledge to properly utilize them. A strange paradox emerges on these canvases. Majestic ruins, clearly created by a highly advanced society, exist side by side with primitive daily life. Grand halls have been converted into stables. Ancient temples serve as ordinary housing. Complex engineering structures simply stand abandoned. Every detail in these paintings silently screams that another world once existed here. A world more powerful, more technological, more majestic than the one that replaced it. Yet what remains of this world evokes in official science only a desire to remain silent or offer absurd explanations. Historians habitually label any incomprehensible object whose original purpose has been forgotten as a temple or a tomb, conveniently ignoring obvious technical contradictions. But a careful examination of Robert's legacy allows us to read a different message entirely. It's as if the artist left us an encrypted chronicle of a catastrophe whose aftermath he personally witnessed. This isn't just painting, this is testimony, and if we accept that these monumental structures were drawn from direct observation, then the entire familiar chronology of human development begins to crack and splinter, exposing a hidden truth about a vanished civilization whose traces we haven't yet learned to properly interpret. When you immerse yourself in detailed study of the architectural subjects Robert captured, it's impossible to shake off an obsessive sensation of wrongness that permeates every element of the composition. This feeling strikes immediately when analyzing the interiors of ancient structures. Consider the famous Temple of Diana at Nîmes. What's presented isn't just a building, but a colossal structure featuring majestic columns and flawless masonry whose quality inspires genuine awe. The space is organized as if it were originally designed for beings of a completely different order, for giants whose footsteps would shake the ground, not for the fragile human figures we see dwarfed by these stone masses. The ordinary people depicted in these settings appear insignificantly small, almost lost among the monumental vaults. They look not like masters or creators of these walls, but like accidental visitors, ants crawling at the base of ancient trees. This visual contrast creates powerful cognitive dissonance. Architectural details like perfectly fitted blocks, arches, and vaults calculated to withstand colossal loads, all testify to the highest level of engineering knowledge and construction technology. It's difficult to imagine that such structures could have been erected using methods available to the people who wandered through these ruins in Robert's time. Moreover, the lower levels of many buildings are clearly submerged in accumulated soil, indicating burial processes, evidence of catastrophic events that occurred long before these views were transferred to canvas. This sense of disproportionate scale manifests even more vividly in landscapes depicting waterways and canals. Long canals stretching into the distance are framed by massive ruins of arches and colonnades, whose dimensions overwhelm the imagination. The arches rise to such heights that human figures beneath them become barely distinguishable dots, foreign objects accidentally caught in the frame. The construction technique is equally striking: flawless geometry, complex ornamental patterns that seem to embody precise mathematical calculations, vaults capable of withstanding incredible pressure. All of this creates the impression that we're looking at remnants of infrastructure from a civilization that possessed technologies completely beyond the understanding of people in subsequent eras. The people wandering along the banks of these grandiose canals or beneath the vaults of ruined temples behave like passive observers. In their actions, there's neither creation nor comprehension of the essence of what surrounds them. They seem to exist in the shadow of giants, completely unaware of the true grandeur of their environment. There's a persistent feeling that these inhabitants have simply occupied an empty shell left behind by someone far more powerful. They don't look like builders capable of designing and erecting such marvels. On the contrary, their presence emphasizes the gap, the profound abyss between the creators of these architectural masterpieces and those who came to replace them. This disconnect between the scale of the buildings and the insignificance of their new inhabitants suggests that the humanity depicted in these paintings represents a kind of parasitic element living on the corpse of a dead giant. New generations simply occupied vacated space, possessing not the slightest understanding of how this world functioned at the height of its prosperity. They wander among the debris, using it as backdrop for their primitive existence, never asking the fundamental question of who actually erected these walls, and if these people didn't build the splendor surrounding them. A legitimate and deeply disturbing question emerges. Who were the true architects of this vanished reality, and where did those for whom these cyclopean dimensions were normal actually disappear to? The answer to this question lies not in history textbooks, but in examining exactly how the new tenants have managed the incomprehensible inheritance they received. What reveals itself upon further study of Hubert Robert's legacy can be characterized as a chronicle of profound civilizational decline. If previous observations concerned the mismatch of scales, now the glaring technological and cultural gap between the creators of these majestic ruins and those who inhabit them comes into sharp focus. A picture unfolds of the life of a society that can accurately be described as a civilization of scavengers, inhabitants of a post-apocalyptic world who have completely forgotten their past. This becomes especially vivid in subjects where grandiose classical structures are being used for purposes completely different from their original intent, adapted for primitive domestic needs. Study the scenes depicting public baths among ruins. You see a striking contrast: massive stone vaults, majestic colonnades, and perfectly engineered arches capable of withstanding colossal pressure serve merely as decoration for washing clothes and bathing bodies. The water filling these reservoirs might once have been part of a complex hydraulic system whose true purpose remains unknown to us. But for the people in the painting, it's simply a convenient pool fenced with stone. They splash in the shadow of engineering masterpieces, completely unaware that they're inside a complex technical device, or sacred complex, whose level of sophistication far exceeds their own understanding of the world. This utilitarian, almost barbaric attitude toward inherited structures appears everywhere. Temples with flawless proportions and decoration that would have required high-precision equipment for stone processing are converted into public pools, market squares, or pens for livestock. Consider structures resembling the famous Maison Carrée in Nîmes. This massive stone building with its columns clearly possessed important functional significance. However, on the canvases, we see people aimlessly wandering through it, or attempting to adapt its walls for drying hay, or organizing temporary shelter. Fragments of capitals and cornices lie scattered about. No one attempts to restore them or return them to their proper places. The locals simply possess neither the tools nor the knowledge to lift these multi-ton blocks, let alone carve new ones with equivalent precision. New generations use these spaces only as ready-made backdrop for survival. They build nothing of equivalent value, but merely parasitize on the remains of former greatness. Their own constructions are flimsy wooden shacks and lean-tos that look like pathetic growths on the body of stone giants. This clearly demonstrates the total loss of construction. Technologies. The secrets of polygonal masonry, precise cutting of hard stone, and the erection of earthquake-resistant structures were irretrievably lost. Society has regressed to primitive manual labor and is now forced to inhabit the skeleton of a deceased, highly advanced civilization, like savages who've moved into an abandoned skyscraper. The original functions of these buildings have been erased from generational memory. What we habitually call temples or thermal baths could have been factories, power stations, or scientific centers. But since knowledge has been lost, people invent simple explanations for these objects, reducing everything to religion or basic survival. It's difficult to escape the thought that we're looking at documented consequences of a global catastrophe. This isn't the natural evolution of architecture. This is survival in ruins. This picture evokes a disturbing sense of irreversible loss. We're witnessing a society afflicted with collective amnesia. They walk on slabs beneath which great secrets are hidden, but they're interested only in finding shelter from the rain under a surviving vault. This break in continuity suggests that the civilization that built these wonders didn't fade away smoothly, passing knowledge to descendants. It disappeared suddenly, leaving behind only stone and feral heirs, incapable of even reading the message encrypted in the architecture itself. But what force could have wiped a culture possessing such powerful capabilities off the face of the earth, reducing its achievements to mysterious decoration for the lives of simple inhabitants? The answer may lie not in what remains standing, but in exactly how these structures were destroyed. Careful analysis of Hubert Robert's canvases inevitably leads to the next, even more frightening discovery, which concerns not just the preservation of buildings, but the very landscape in which they're situated. If we discard the conventional explanation that ruins result from centuries of natural decay, an image emerges of the aftermath of a massive geological cataclysm. The buildings in these paintings aren't just destroyed by time, they're literally buried alive. Huge masses of soil, clay, and earth conceal the lower floors, radically altering the familiar geometry of space and forcing us to reconsider the nature of the catastrophe that engulfed this ancient world. Look at the depiction of ruins from a classical Doric temple. You can observe a strange pattern. Majestic columns, whose proportions speak of striving toward ideal harmony, don't stand on solid foundations. They appear to be drowning in deposits of earth. Part of the colonnade has collapsed, and the chaotic scattering of giant stone segments testifies to an instantaneous and powerful impact. This doesn't resemble the slow death of architecture under wind and rain. The scene looks like the aftermath of a massive shockwave, or earthquake followed by flows of mud that filled the spaces between debris. Vegetation is already breaking through the thickness of this new soil layer, which has hidden foundations and possibly entire underground levels, forever sealing whatever secrets they contained. Even more disturbing questions arise from the depiction of the Colosseum. On Robert's canvases, this symbol of Rome appears not as a solemn arena of antiquity, but as a giant, semi-abandoned structure that has survived a global flood or mudflow. The lower tiers of arches, which logically should serve as ground-level entrances, are half or more buried under thick layers of accumulated soil. Official historiography loves to explain such phenomena through the accumulation of the so-called cultural layer. We're told that over 1,500 years, garbage and dust gradually raised the ground level by several meters. However, any engineer or geologist will confirm the absurdity of this claim, given the scales recorded by the artist. To bury the first floor of a structure as grand as the Colosseum requires not dust from citizen sandals, but millions of cubic meters of dense material. Such burial doesn't happen by itself through gradual accumulation. This is the characteristic signature of liquid soil movement. Mudflows, tsunamis, or soil liquefaction caused by planetary scale catastrophe. The building appears as if it stood in the path of a colossal mud surge which, upon receding, left behind meters of sedimentary deposits, transforming first floors into basements. Arches that once admitted thousands of spectators have become narrow burrows one can barely squeeze through. This is visual evidence that the catastrophe occurred relatively recently, by the standards of the depicted era, as the ruins haven't yet had time to completely level with the ground. But the landscape has already changed beyond recognition. The nature of the destruction and the soil levels in Robert's paintings speak to one reality. The history we've been taught omits a key event, an event that didn't just destroy an empire, but literally reshape the surface of the earth, burying the achievements of high culture under layers of clay and silt. We see the tips of icebergs, the upper tiers of buildings, while the main portion of the infrastructure lies deep beneath the feet of careless inhabitants of this new world. And if even a giant like the Colosseum appears as merely the tip of a more complex structure protruding from the ground, this forces us to completely reconsider the purpose of these objects. After all, if the greater part of a building is hidden underground, how can we accurately judge its true function? Were these structures really just palaces, temples, and arenas for entertainment? Or is their visible portion just a casing, concealing complex mechanisms and systems underneath whose meaning was lost, along with the buried floors? Shifting focus from artistic expression to engineering logic, the researcher inevitably faces the need to rethink the very purpose of the depicted objects. If we discard romantic interpretation and examine these ruins through the eyes of a technologist, familiar designations like villa, pavilion, or port begin to seem like naive labels attached to complex technical devices whose true functions have been forgotten. What's customarily considered decorative elements of garden and park architecture reveals signs of large-scale industrial complexes upon closer inspection. A striking example of this discrepancy appears in depictions of so-called pavilions with cascades. At first glance, this presents an idyllic landscape created to delight aristocratic eyes. However, the structure of the water flow and the stonework framing it tells a different story. The cascade doesn't resemble a natural phenomenon or light decoration. It's rigidly integrated into a massive stone structure with clear geometry, terraces, and spillways. This architecture resembles the remains of a dam, a lock system, or even a hydroelectric station far more than a park ornament. The massiveness of the walls and the precision of block processing indicate that the structure was designed to handle colossal water pressure and immense forces. For a simple fountain, such excessive strength and complexity are completely unnecessary. Most likely, the artist captured a fragment of a lost water distribution system, or energy node, which, over time, having lost its mechanisms, transformed into a picturesque waterfall, while its concrete or stone skeleton was adapted as a location for leisurely walks. Similar questions emerge when analyzing structures such as the Villa Madama. The viewer is presented with a building that even in the 18th century already appeared as a relic from another era. The internal volumes, the height of the arches, the thickness of the walls, all are absolutely excessive for a residential dwelling, even an extremely wealthy one. Enormous empty halls that would be impossible to effectively heat or illuminate with the technology of that period resemble factory floors, hangars, or public terminals rather than comfortable living chambers. A persistent impression forms that architects of the Renaissance and subsequent centuries didn't build these structures from scratch, but merely engaged in repurposing the surviving shells of ancient industrial or administrative centers. They inserted windows into giant openings, laid floors, hung tapestries, attempting to inhabit spaces that were originally intended for completely different, probably technical purposes. The industrial signature becomes even more obvious when examining port structures like the Port of Ripetta. Here, urban development literally grows from ancient megalithic foundations. Embankments, staircases, and retaining walls are constructed from blocks of such size and quality of fitting that they evoke associations with modern concrete fortifications at strategic facilities. This isn't just a pier for wooden boats. This is an engineering structure from a high culture, calculated for centuries of operation and serious loads. City life flows atop these ruins, using them as indestructible foundation, but not understanding the principles of their creation. It resembles parasitism on the remains of highly developed infrastructure, where complex logistical nodes from the past are repurposed as simple wharves. Taken together, these observations form an image of a world permeated by a complex engineering network of which only the stone skeleton remains. We're not seeing isolated buildings, but nodes of a unified system: stations, factories, hydraulic complexes. The tragedy lies in the total loss of understanding of how this system functioned. People in the paintings exist inside a broken mechanism, perceiving its components as elements of landscape. This brings us to perhaps the most poignant image in Robert's work: the solitary hermit praying amidst giant ruins. This figure becomes a metaphor for all humanity of that era. A man bows his head before a greatness whose nature he's incapable of comprehending. He offers prayers in a space that was possibly a machine hall or laboratory. For him, these walls are sacred only because they're grandiose and incomprehensible. He seeks spiritual answers where precise calculation and technology once reigned, finally confirming the victory of myth over knowledge. Summarizing this extensive investigation, the figure of Hubert Robert appears in a completely different light. From a talented artist following fashion for romanticizing decay, he transforms into a key witness of an era that can accurately be called the time of a world reset. His legacy ceases to be merely a collection of paintings and acquires the status of detailed photographic documentation from the scene of a highly advanced civilization's collapse. Each painting represents documented fact, evidence preserved to this day despite the attempts of time and humanity to erase memory of the true past. Robert didn't invent ruins. He recorded a moment when traces of global catastrophe were still fresh, when the giant skeletons of buildings hadn't yet been dismantled for building materials, and the soil layer deposited by flooding hadn't yet been concealed under new paving stones. Official historical science, confronted with such visual evidence, finds itself in an extremely uncomfortable position. Academic circles prefer either to maintain modest silence, ignoring inconvenient details, or offer explanations that don't withstand criticism upon closer inspection. We're asked to believe that cyclopean structures requiring complex logistics, mathematical modeling, and machine processing of stone for their construction were built with primitive tools for religious or burial purposes. The universal answer of "it's a temple" or "it's a tomb" has become a convenient screen concealing fundamental lack of understanding about the true purpose of these technical objects. But the longer we examine these supposed temples, the clearer we see workshops, stations, and engineering nodes whose meaning was lost along with their creators. Eyes cannot be deceived, even when textbooks insist otherwise. A panorama unfolds of a world that wasn't just different, but grander, more complex, and more technologically advanced than our own. We're accustomed to thinking of progress as a linear process leading from primitive to sophisticated. But the ruins and Robert's paintings demonstrate the opposite: involution, loss of knowledge, technological regression. We witness a society that didn't develop but merely survived on the rubble of titans, adapting their heritage to modest needs. This realization evokes a dizzying sense of loss, but simultaneously incredible curiosity. Because if these buildings existed, it means the history of humanity was completely different, filled with events and achievements we've been trained to forget. These canvases serve as reminders of civilization's fragility. What seems unshakable today may tomorrow become mysterious ruins for descendants who will speculate about the purpose of our cities. Robert and other master painters of ruins left us keys to solving this mystery. Perhaps they understood that soon these traces would disappear, be built over, restored beyond recognition, or finally destroyed completely. They hurried to capture truth on canvas. Their works are messages in bottles thrown across centuries in the hope that someday there would be those capable of reading them correctly, casting aside imposed dogmas. Today we stand before a choice: continue blindly believing approved versions where everything is neatly organized but doesn't align with observable facts, or trust our own eyes and logic. History was rewritten, but stone remembers everything. The ruins captured by Robert continue silently testifying to a world that was stolen from us. And it depends only on us whether we want to reclaim this memory. If you're ready to ask uncomfortable questions, search for alternative answers, and examine familiar objects from new angles, this investigation is just beginning. Do you believe the textbooks or what you see with your own eyes? The truth exists somewhere nearby, among buried columns and ruined arches, and the time has come to uncover it.